Hello friends, welcome to my channel. I'm Cassidy Carson and this is The Life of a Writer. Today I'm going to take us back in time a little bit to talk about what it was like to submit manuscripts in the 1980s when I first started writing. Now, people who were born in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you may be familiar with some of this, but some of it may be absolutely new to you, especially if you're one of the younger generations and you happen to come across this. So I hope you find the information interesting, and it is quite a different experience to submit your manuscript now than it was to submitting your manuscript back in those days. So I'll start out with a photo of myself from 1982. This was not long after my husband and I got married, and I was doing a little bit of research with the available options for me at that time, and it was mainly reading a book on the subject that I wanted to write about, or reading a book for fun that might inspire an idea that I would later incorporate into my writing. You will see beside me a newspaper. This would have been the Omaha World Herald, because we did live in Nebraska at the time, Bellevue, Nebraska, just south of Omaha, and it was something that I believe we got on a daily basis to keep up with the news, which most people don't do anymore because physical newspapers are really a thing of the past. You do see them out and about at times, but I wonder how many people actually purchase a physical copy. So newspapers, magazines, books, those types of things would be my research materials. We didn't have a lot of income at that time, so many of the books and magazines and even newspapers I would read at the library. Going to the local library was a wonderful way to get out of the house, especially during the summer months where it was very hot in Nebraska. So we would go to the library, enjoy an afternoon in the air conditioning there because we had none in our little apartment. And I could spend quiet time reading, looking through various magazines and newspapers, and then taking probably notes on my notebook, college rule notebook with my number 2 pencil, which would be my writing tool of choice at the time, because as I mentioned, we didn't have a lot of income. So the first stories that I started playing with would have been written longhand in a college rule notebook with either a pencil or pen, but more often a pencil so that I could make any corrections that I wanted to. Now, writing out longhand is great, and some people still do it, but that is not something that you could submit to a potential agent or a publisher in order to get your work published. So in time, my very supportive husband bought me a Smith Corona portable typewriter, an electric typewriter. And that was something that I used for many years throughout the 1980s to type up manuscripts. I still do have hard copies of those manuscripts. One of them is actually down on the shelf at my desk here that I have gone back to reread and cringed over, because we all know that our writing does evolve and improve over time if we work at it long enough. So those early works are not up to what I would call my current standards, but I was doing the best I could with what I had at the time. And so those typewritten manuscripts were something that could be a challenge, because typewriters, unlike computers, let me say there were some typewriters that did allow you to do corrections, where you could do a backspace correction with the typewriter. Those came along later. The typewriter I had did not have that function. So I would have used something like a typewriter eraser. And if I can find a photo of that, I will pop it in here. Basically, it looks like a pencil with a little brush on the end. And you would erase whatever mistakes you made on the page, and then use the brush to sweep away the shavings or the residue from that erasure, because those shavings would go down into the typewriter and gum up the works, and you didn't want that. Also, whenever we're creating a manuscript, we want to have a backup copy, especially if you're sending it out by mail. And the option for that with the typewriter was to use a carbon paper. Carbon paper, for anyone who's familiar, is a very messy proposition. the back side of the paper would rub off and you would have either blue or black staining your fingers. It smudged on the page. So the front copy, the first page, would be before the carbon paper, and then there would be a second sheet of paper behind that. So you're creating a little sandwich with the carbon paper in the center. And then the whatever you typed would be copied onto the second page so that you would have a copy of your manuscript. Now, using an eraser or whiteout to make changes with carbon paper, you had to stop. You had to roll up the page far enough so that you could change both parts of both pages, your clean copy and your second copy. And then you'd have to roll it back down into the right place. That was a very big challenge. And there would be many times when the letters would not be all even in a sentence or in a paragraph because I'd had to go back so many times to make those changes. So that could be a very frustrating experience, and don't even get me started on any pre-printed forms that you had to type into a specific field because those were really difficult to line up. Typewriters were great. I enjoyed having a typewriter. It saved me a lot of hand cramps and helped with the callus that I have on my finger from writing out longhand, but it's also much more difficult than typing up a manuscript on a computer these days because they're being able to not only erase things that you don't want anymore, but to just copy and paste them or move them around is such a nice feature. And as troublesome as computers can be, we all have issues with technology at one point or another, even to the point where we may lose a saved file of our manuscript, which is a horror, believe me. And you should always have a second copy backed up somewhere. But they do provide so much more flexibility when you're writing. So that is a really positive advancement, I think, in the ability to write and publish. But back in the 1980s, like I said, it was typewriters. And once the clean copy of the manuscript was done, that would be tucked into a manila envelope with a cover letter and sent out via snail mail. Now, in order to figure out where this manuscript would be sent, you'd need to do a little research. And again, like previously, some of this research I would do at the local library. Depending on where you lived, your library might not have had this resource available, but a very good way to find out where to submit your writing was the Writer's Market by Writer's Digest. And it is something that I believe people may use to this day. I think it is still available in both hard copy and probably online. At one point, I remember buying myself a copy of the book Writer's Market that came with the CD in the cover. If anyone remembers those days where you would get a second copy that you could use once we started getting computers because we didn't have yet internet access. Excuse me. Sorry. Little throat dry today. So go to the library, hopefully, and find a copy of the Writer's Market, which broke things down into various categories. So there would be genre fiction, there would be regular fiction, there would be nonfiction. It went so far as to do sections on writing for greeting cards for places like Hallmark or writing jokes for people. There were a variety of subject areas that you could write for, and then there would be little sections in between these basically lists of places where you could try to publish your work. And these sections would provide background on published authors, usually authors who probably were working with Writer's Digest to maybe provide some kind of a guide, because there are a lot of Writer's Digest books available for authors, and I did refer to those quite frequently. I do have a library of probably very outdated Writer's Digest books, but I went through a period of time where I did buy these books whenever we could afford them, and I do keep them on hand. And even though some of the material may be out of date, some of the information never changes. So it's always good to have a little extra information on hand just in case you need it for refreshing your memory. So then you have typed up your manuscript on your typewriter after a long and frustrating time of making sure that everything came out clean, that the copy you were going to send out to the publishers or agents was as clean as you could make it. And you put it in the mail because you've used your Writer's Digest and you've found a series of places where you want to submit your work. And then you kind of just sit back and wait and wait and wait. Now, of course, in some places, and depending on what you were writing, you wouldn't send out a full document. Sometimes, like today, you would try to get an agent first because there were only some publishing companies that would accept unagented work. So you'd go through the process of sending out your writing to the agents first before you even got to the publishers. And, very similar today. I think pretty much everywhere requires that you have an agent to try to get someone to read your work. And I understand that there are reasons for that. Some of them are basically because there have been people who felt that maybe their work was ripped off, and having an agent as an intermediary can be a protection against that. Also, it is another level of making sure that your work is clean enough to be read by the very busy editors that work for these publishing houses. So I understand the reasons for it, but it is hard for people who have trouble finding a publisher or finding an agent because, even today it is very difficult to get representation. And that was a very challenging time for many people. It remains challenging, but independent publishing, self-publishing has changed that so that we have the option to just put our work out into the world without going through the long and involved process of finding an agent and then having your agent to submit to all the publishing houses. And, if you are a writer, the whole thing. The how long it takes to get through that process. So independent publishing has been a wonderful way to get around that and get your work out to the public more quickly and without all the frustration of sending out that snail mail and sitting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And usually the envelope would come back. Maybe they had opened it just long enough to put a letter in there saying, we don't accept unagented submissions, or this is not right for us, usually a form letter of some type that was typed up. I got many that were not even a full sheet of paper. They would do something on the what looked like an index card, so you knew that they were all pre-printed, and they just, they would look, pull it out, probably just glance at the first page, tuck that card in there and mail it right back to you. And what you had to do, not only did you send out the manuscript in the manila envelope with your postage to get to the agent or publisher, but then you had to include a self-addressed stamped envelope for the return. So it was like adding insult to injury that you had to pay for the return of your rejected manuscript as well. Now, I don't know how many people actually send anything out through snail mail anymore. So this is a very different process from the 1980s to today. That's probably the biggest change, I think, in submitting to agents and publishers. And so, as I mentioned, early 1980s, 1982, 1983, my tools of choice would have been a Smith Corona portable electric typewriter, my carbon paper whiteout or a typewriter eraser, manila envelopes, stamps. If I was writing a script, a spec script for something like I tried submitting a few times to Star Trek The Next Generation, you would need the little, they're brass paper fasteners that at the time I used to call them brads. I don't know if that was a common term, but I heard that somewhere, so I call them brads. Of course, you would need reams of typewriter paper, and you would need somewhere to submit your work. So you'd probably want to get a copy of the Writer's Market if you couldn't find one at your local library. So for research, I mentioned newspapers, magazines, books. I had an old copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica from my childhood. If anyone is familiar with those, they were out of date pretty quickly, and they only gave you a brief synopsis of certain subject areas. So most of the information was not only quickly outdated, but it didn't provide a lot of detail of what you were researching. It might just give you at least a few phrases or terms that you could throw into your writing, but you would then want to go and find a more detailed reference work on whatever topic you were looking for. So I had a set of those at home, even in those early days, but they probably dated to the late 1960s or the early 1970s, so they were woefully out of date and not something you'd want to rely on, especially if you were writing on a nonfiction topic and you wanted to get some really good detailed information. I didn't do a lot of that. Most of my nonfiction writing was related to things I had personally experienced. I didn't tend to write on topics, like on health issues or financial issues or current events or things like that. It was more of my life dealing with finances at home, with grocery shopping, with children, all those types of subjects. So those would be the nonfiction topics that I wrote about, and I didn't do a lot of detailed research into them. Now, getting into the late 1980s, we did end up getting ourselves a computer. In 1988, we bought an Apple IIc Plus. And in researching this video, I found out that this was only available from September of 1988 up until around 1990, I believe. The IIc Plus became quickly outdated. Technology moves on very quickly. The computer that we had at the time still exists and is in the home of our youngest daughter, who has a bit of a museum to typewriters and old computers that we've had over the years. So that is something, if anyone is familiar with computers of the time, it had the very heavy monitor that would take up most of your desk space, plus the I do have a photo that I will pop in, but it had the separate keyboard. The keyboard had a slot for a 3-inch floppy, plus we had an external 5 1/4, I believe, inch, yes, a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk. Then we had an Apple Image Writer printer attached to our computer. So we no longer had to do quite as much work in trying to make sure the copy of the typed copy of the manuscript was clean. Some of that we could do on screen, but at that time, the option was to type up your manuscript and save it to a disk. So you could make the corrections and changes on screen, then you'd have to save it to your disk to have that. I actually still have some disk files around with a lot of my old manuscripts on them that, since we no longer have the computer, they're really not good for anything, but they're interesting. And then we would print out the hard copy to send to the publisher because we didn't yet have internet access or a way to email anything. I believe in the early 1990s, the beginnings of the internet and the ability to email people, it was out there. There were things that I know academic institutions, universities would have maybe internal email systems where people could email back and forth within the institution, but it wasn't as widely accessible as it is these days. So the Apple computer that we had back in 1988, 89 was mainly an upgrade to the typewriter, but it wasn't yet connected to the world at large. And the paper that we used in this Apple Image Writer, which was a dot matrix printer, we used a continuous feed paper that would have holes on either side that you would feed through, and there were cogs within the printer that would pull. You had to make sure everything was lined up properly to get those sheets fed through cleanly, or else you were going to have a jam and a mess. And then once you printed out whatever you were printing, you had to detach all the pages and remove the side pieces that had the holes, the guides to get them through the printer. So that was another frustrating challenge because you couldn't just, square up your papers and toss them in an envelope. You had to actually prepare them. And the dot matrix, it took forever. It was very noisy. It, at least in our case, it was a very faint printing. And anyone who's familiar with that will understand exactly what I'm talking about. It was not up to current printer standards in any way whatsoever. but it was definitely an improvement over the typewriters that I began using in the early 1980s. Now, of course, today, here in 2025, I no longer use a typewriter. The typewriter I had in those days, I believe, is in my daughter's Museum of Antique Equipment, but as well as the Apple IIc Plus. I still have some of the discs around, but basically what I do now is I'll sit down at my desktop computer and type there I have dual monitors, so I can sometimes I'll have an Excel spreadsheet of my characters on one side, and then I'll have my document on the other side, or I may have a website up where I'm looking up some research item to help round out a detail within the story. So everything is right there. And in fact, I could even do all of my writing on the phone that I'm using to record this video, because we have apps that allow us to type things or dictate things into our phone. They can wirelessly connect to a printer, and then you print out a clean copy of whatever you're doing. So some people may not even need a computer. You can do everything you need on your phone, which is a huge change from the early 1980s, when it was such a chore to have to go out to do your research and, track down a specific book or magazine or newspaper article or whatever you wanted to find. And it was time consuming, and it was a very different world than it is now. And anyone who writes now will understand that there are still challenges. We do still need to go through the process of trying to find an agent before getting a publisher. You'll email out your manuscript, or you may use an online, something like Query Tracker. I've never used those, so I'm not very familiar with them, but there are ways to track and submit things online without ever having to go through the post office. And then, unfortunately, sometimes you get an almost immediate response where somebody says, oh, this is not right for us, which is not as frustrating as waiting weeks and weeks or months and months to hear back, but it's still, it hurts. Whenever you're rejected, it hurts. So that was a quick little walk down memory lane. I hope you enjoyed some of the images I shared. The one of myself with my youngest sitting at my Apple IIc Plus writing while she napped. My kids were pretty much contact nappers. I would have to lay down with them, but she would like to sit on my lap and she would play with things. And underneath the desk chair, I noticed there was a box that would have had blank 5.5-inch floppies in it. She was probably playing with that, chewing on it. There were some Duplos on the floor. And just as a side note, that daughter, the one that sat on my lap while I was typing, she is also an author now and has published probably more than 100 books. And she's also the one who has the obsolete equipment museum in her house. So having her on my lap while I worked, she remembered me taking phone calls with editors and things like that. I like to think that maybe that shaped a little bit of what she decided to do with her life. And in fact, 2 of our kids write, and our third is a teacher. So what we do, our kids do watch that as they're growing up, and sometimes it can influence them, because I did not suggest to my kids that they become writers, for sure. It can be a very frustrating and challenging profession, and it's very worthwhile, but it's definitely something that I think they picked up from me over the years. So thank you for following along on this little trip down memory lane into what it was like to write and submit your work in the 1980s. Please feel free to leave any questions you might have about the process, anything I didn't clarify well enough, or if something I said may have jogged your memory, if you were also writing at that time period, please feel free to share that below. Anyway, I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.